Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt inside the Beltway. Senator Tom Cotton joins me now. Good morning, Senator. How are you?
I'm doing well, Hugh. Good morning. It's good to be
I've been accused this morning of being culturally out of touch because I do not know what Bucky's is. Are you familiar with Bucky's?
A little bit, Hugh. A little bit. I mean,
I've never been in a Bucky's, and Dwayne has decorated his front lawn with Bucky's. So I'm just curious, does Arkansas have Bucky's?
Not to my knowledge. I've seen some over in Tennessee on the drive home from Washington to Arkansas, but I've not seen any in Arkansas to my knowledge. It's always possible, though. It's a big state.
All right. Well, you go on, because I've got to now visit a Bucky's because Dwayne has told me it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. Senator, I want to ask you about when you were a platoon leader, or you were actually going through Ranger School, or you were going through basic training or officer candidate school, whatever you did, there's always one guy or one gal at the end of the line. There's a bell curve and everything, right? And they would screw up drills. Did that happen to you where there's always one soldier who would screw something up?
It does always happen, Hugh, in any organizations, including the military. There's one kind of high drag, low speed soldier that you're usually waiting on.
And so it happens in every company. There's a bell curve and everything. Well, the bell curve has an end, and it's named Matt Gaetz. Now, I don't expect you to dump on a former colleague from the House. Did you ever overlap in the House? I guess you didn't, did you?
I did not, no, Hugh.
Have you met Matt?
Only briefly, Hugh, only briefly.
I would just like to know if you know what the strategy is after they remove Kevin McCarthy from the speakership, if they, meaning Matt Gaetz and friends, are successful. You're a member, you're a House alum. What happens if you don't have a speaker?
Well, I certainly hope that the House won't remove Kevin McCarthy. There's zero grounds to do so. I think Kevin has been a strong leader this year for the House of Representatives, and I think it would result probably in paralysis and chaos in the House at a time when we're trying to fund the government and address our border crisis and address the growing crime wave all across America. For the House to be kind of racked with indecision over inside baseball and turmoil is not something that the American people, that's going to deliver positive results for the American people, and therefore something that we should be spending our time on.
Well, it's also destructive of focusing on things like, there is a story this morning on the idiocy of the Biden investigation run by Treasury and IRS that was frustrated by the tax division. I would be talking about that this morning, except for the fact Matt Gaetz is trying to bring down the House Republican caucus. Is there any explanation, in your view, for what he's doing?
No, Hugh, I really don't have one, no.
Right.
Again, I mean, it's fine to have differences of opinion. It's fine for congressmen to have voted against that spending bill that we passed on Saturday. But I just don't see what's productive about trying to remove the Speaker of the House at a time when we have a razor-thin majority. What the members of the House Republican caucus should be doing, what the vast majority of them are trying to do, is put together 218 Republican votes on every piece of legislation. That's the source of power they have. That's the leverage they have against Chuck Schumer's Senate and against Joe Biden. And when they can't do that, and especially when they turn on each other and spend their time fighting each other, that simply undermines the goals that Republican voters expect us to pursue.
Now, there was reporting over the weekend that there was division in the Senate GOP caucus on how to proceed. But a vote was taken, and the majority's position was adopted, and those who lost the vote went along. In other words, it's a grown-up caucus. Am I correct in my reporting?
Well, I think it's fair to say on almost every piece of legislation we consider that there's some divisions. And usually whenever it's fighting over, government funding, especially when you're up against the deadline, there's sometimes pretty stark and passionate divisions. But you're correct that in the end, you cast your votes, and the next vote around, you make people who were your adversaries this time are going to be your critical allies next time.
Now, the last thing I'd like to talk with you about, Congressman, is you've done a lot of work for various Republican candidates across the country. It's not easy to get elected to Congress in a closely divided country, and you need an apparatus. And Kevin McCarthy has built an extraordinarily effective one. What happens if that comes? I mean, what happens to just say donors if they see chaos in Washington?
Yeah, that's a big problem right in the middle of the cycle. We've seen transition in our leadership in the House, for instance, from John Boehner to Paul Ryan and Kevin McCarthy. And there's always questions about whether the new leader will be able to politically live up to his predecessor. In every case, they've actually improved. Kevin McCarthy probably has the best political operation, is the most prolific fundraiser yet for House Republicans. It's one thing to do that in an orderly fashion after an election, Hugh. It would be, in my opinion, extremely risky for House Republicans to maintain the majority and grow the majority to try to change horses electorally in the middle of the stream, because Kevin McCarthy has done a great job in recruiting outstanding candidates and raising the money necessary to fight back Democratic attacks.
Now, what really drives me a little bit crazy, Senator, is that Virginia is trying to elect a House of Delegates and a state Senate to support Glenn Youngkin, and this is dropping in the middle of it. Even the hardcore Trump supporters out there ought to realize that we should be talking this morning about the absurd trial that Donald Trump is in. And I mean, it really is absurd in New York. It's persecution. And we're not. We're not doing any of that. What about basic politics eludes our far right wing?
Yeah, again, Hugh, this is just an example of how the internal turmoil that's been unleashed now is overshadowing important other matters, whether it's legislation we're trying to pass or highlighting what the Democrats are doing, in the continued efforts to get Trump through the distortion of every legal precedent, or the failures of Joe Biden and what Joe Biden is doing. There's reporting. All the reporting today is going to be about the drama in the House. It's not going to be about the 5,000 to 10,000 new migrants that crossed the border today, and we'll do so again tomorrow. I think our time and effort is much better spent on trying to solve the American people's problems and highlighting how Joe Biden has made those problems worse.
There is also a story on the landing page of the Washington Post this morning about a Hunter Biden tax investigation and how the tax division at Justice squelched it for 2.5 years. We're not talking about that because of Matt Gaetz. It makes me crazy. I want to turn to Ukraine. Admiral Stavridis pointed out to me yesterday, and I did not know this, that if Russia wins in Ukraine, they will control 30% of the wheat in the world. 30%. Another means by which they can blackmail our friends and ally with our enemies in Beijing. Does the president have has he ever made an effort to try and persuade people about why Ukraine is in our best interest to remain free?
No, to my knowledge, Hugh, Joe Biden has never given, for instance, a White House speech about our efforts in Ukraine, something that, say, Ronald Reagan certainly would have done. And he's usually speaks in kind of grandiose Wilsonian terms, explaining what we're doing in Ukraine in terms of why it's good for Ukraine. Well, obviously it's good for the people of Ukraine, or why it's good for global solidarity or NATO unity or some other such abstraction. What the American people need to understand is why it's good for Americans. The most basic reason is that the lessons of history have taught us is that we have to stand up against unprovoked aggression early, firmly, and strongly if you don't want to encourage more of it, not just by Russia, but by countries like China. But then, as Admiral Staff said, there are other more specific reasons as well, like the threat to global food markets and the instability that could create and the inflation that it could cause at home. So there's lots of reasons that we're supporting Ukraine fighting this war that benefit Americans. And that's what Americans need to hear from Joe Biden, and they never get it from Biden.
Last question, Senator. In the green room last night before special report, Guy Benson was telling us a story about his Uber driver. He's up at Northwestern. And the Uber driver, who is very anti-Trump, nevertheless came around to the fact that, to explain to Guy, she couldn't afford to do her job, her second job, because the price of gas was going up and the cost of bread. Now, I had checked with the fetching Mrs. Hewitt, and a loaf of Dave's bread costs $6 a loaf now. I don't like Dave's bread, but she buys it anyway. It's too good for you. But do you hear from constituents every day that they are out of rope, that they don't have any margin left?
Okay, Hugh. I hear routinely from Arkansans who are struggling. And these are not people who are kind of on the margins of society, who come on and off welfare programs. In many cases, these are dual-income families making well over the median household income for the state of Arkansas, who have always put their groceries on their credit card bill and paid it off at the end of the month, but now are having to float that credit card debt because, as you say, prices for staples, not luxuries, but staples like bread and milk and eggs and meats are still much higher than they were 2 years ago or 3 years ago. And I know that all the eggheads in Joe Biden's White House want to keep telling you, well, if you squint really hard and you remove volatile measures from core inflation, you'll see that the rate of increase is now down to, an acceptable level. That's not the way a farmer and a teacher in Arkansas think about it. They think that prices are higher now than they were when Joe Biden took office. And that's why Joe Biden has such terrible approval ratings on the economy. What they want is for prices to be lower again.
In fact, Josh Kraushaar just posted another poll showing ours with a historically large advantage on the economy over Biden. Biden White House still doubling down on the Bidenomics brand. I hope they hug that Bidenomics brand forever, Senator. Do your friends have like Bidenomics sweater vests, the kind of stuff that they wear?
Yeah, I think that might be the 2024 campaign motto for Republicans and the White House. Bidenomics. That's enough.
It's one-word campaign. And if Matt Gaetz would get out of the way, we could talk about it. Senator Tom Cotton, always a pleasure to talk to you, Senator. Thank you so much. Don't go anywhere, America. I'm going to talk after the break.